Now, I don't have time to go into the bureaucracy. Tony, no doubt, will comment on aspects of it. But, you see, in a situation like this, where even well-meaning revolutionaries like Che Guevara find themselves in a position of power, unless you rest yourself wholly on the working class, and to do that you have to have a theoretical understanding of why the working class is the key class in the creation of the workers' state and the socialist revolution, then you will become the prisoner of the bureaucracy, or at the very least, you will find yourself railing against the symptoms of bureaucracy without understanding that the key to solving that problem lies in the working class having day-to-day power. Che Guevara said in 1961 very rashly that industrialization would be completed within 12 months. A couple of months later, he was complaining about all sorts of shortages, all sorts of problems that were developing in the economy. And you know, as an individual, he did refuse to take the privileges that were on offer from the bureaucracy. As Tony's book makes clear, Che lived a very auguste life in terms of not taking the privileges and so on. He was extremely abstemious. But nevertheless, Che as an individual, without having an understanding of what this bureaucracy meant, where it had come from, and how it would develop, could not really address the fundamental questions. So, you know, from time to time, as Tony's book makes clear, he railed against the manufacturers of toothpaste. He said, you know, you've got this marvellous toothpaste, he said, it makes your teeth really white, but in the space of a couple of months, it begins to form like concrete inside the tube, and you can't use it anymore. Why is this? In other situations, in the trade the Cubans had with the Soviets, you know, all sorts of deals were done. And without the working class controlling those deals at either end, in Russia or in Cuba, all sorts of manufactures were made which were not suitable for Cuban agriculture or for the Russian consumer market itself. Now, comrades, I'm rapidly running out of time, and so really many of these other questions will have to be dealt with only in very sketchy form. But as in China, in the Great Cultural Revolution, or as in the Soviet Union in the late 1920s, when Stalin was forced to make an extreme U-turn and borrow the program of the left opposition and carry through mass industrialization and collectivization in an absolutely horrendous manner without the involvement of the people, so too from time to time the Cuban economy has lurched from centralization to decentralization in order to try and find a way out of the problem which is caused by the lack of working class running society. So in 1967 they launched the Great Revolutionary Offensive. They denounced, Castro denounced the bureaucracy, nothing new there. Stalin denounced the bureaucracy in the past. Mao denounced the bureaucracy. Tito in Yugoslavia denounced the bureaucracy. It's a very traditional thing for the bureaucrats to do, because of course in doing so they hope to shape things up a bit to actually make the economy work more effectively. But the denunciations of the bureaucracy are always ineffective in these situations, precisely because it's the bureaucracy itself which cannot do the one thing the working class needs it to do, which is to take itself off of the back of the working class and allow the working class to run society itself. Now, comrades, I haven't had time to deal with other significant events in the revolution, the Bay of Pigs intervention by the US and so on, which are very important developments in terms of further spurring the revolution on. But the question of the Cuban Revolution in terms of the Soviet Union was one of the Soviets actually welcoming the Cuban Revolution after the fact. Once they had seen the Cuban Revolution, then the Soviets embraced Cuba. But that should tell us something as well. Because, of course, the Soviet Union did not embrace the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. It did not embrace even the Czechoslovakian Revolution of 1968. Khrushchev and the other Soviets saw in Cuba a revolution which was not fundamentally threatening to the Soviet Union, and on the other hand, a revolution which was extremely useful in a realpolitik way towards the Soviets being able to establish greater prestige and so on in that area of the world so traditionally dominated by the United States itself. Cuba was utterly dependent on Russian aid. Over $1 million a day flowed into Havana to keep the Cuban Revolution alive. And let's be very clear, if that aid had not been carried through, then it would have been impossible on the basis of a tiny island like Cuba to have carried through and sustained the revolution. Marxists have to be very honest. History does not allow us to lie or see things through rose-tinted spectacles. We have to say that it's not possible to create even the beginnings of a worker state, a genuine worker state, and sustain that if the revolution remains isolated to one country. In a backward country, moreover, in a country wholly dependent on one crop for its exports, which is what Cuba faced in 1960, it's impossible to develop a healthy worker state. Now, does that mean that it was correct for Castro and Che and others not to appeal to the workers of the world and to pragmatically do the best they could? Well, of course, we would defend it, you know, that they're defending the revolution. But it was never the method of Bolshevism for Lenin or for Trotsky to turn inwards, to believe that socialism in one country could be created. And moreover, the idea that the guerrilla struggle was the way forward and the key to the unfolding Latin American revolution was perhaps the most baleful legacy that Castro and Che and the others left, because in countries in the continent of Latin America, in Brazil particularly, in Uruguay, in Argentina, where you had highly developed working classes, there it was much clearer than even in Cuba the primary role of the industrial proletariat, even in the 1960s, and of course much, much more so today. And this idea of guerrillaism, of elevating that guerrilla tactic as a tactic superior to the building of the revolutionary movement in the working class, was an extraordinarily complex mistake that they made, which was to have very complex repercussions in terms of the dead end, frankly, that many of the movements in Latin America went down in the 1960s. So, comrades, to conclude, you know, we have to understand that the Cuban Revolution was an enormously significant event in both ending landlordism and capitalism on that island, but in giving a huge boost to the idea that, you know, the revolution is possible. The revolution distorted itself, though. The revolution was born in a distorted manner because of the lack of clarity of the leaders themselves. We do not judge Fidel Castro or Che Guevara in terms of black and white, whether they were good or bad, whether their ideas were rubbish or good. We have to understand they were honest revolutionaries in that period. They were driven by events, and in a sense were prisoners of events. Che in particular, however, sought to understand what was taking place, was ruthless in his denunciations of the shortcoming of the Cuban regime, but nevertheless even Che saw the idea of exporting revolution, particularly in his later years, as mainly being, you know, about building a guerrilla movement in other countries similar to the movement that had been built in Cuba. And as Castro himself remarks in the Havana Declaration, and didn't always, you know, obviously think about the conclusions of this remark, revolution cannot be exported artificially. Revolution comes from the earth and the soil of the people themselves, and the revolutionary's job is to plant themselves in the earth, in the soil, but above all in the factories and in the offices. Why do we elevate the role of the working class? It isn't because we think all workers are marvellous. You know, some workers fight each other over silly things like the fact that Swansea are in the Premiership in Cardiff aren't. It isn't about that. It's about understanding that the social force of the working class constitutes the only class that is consistently capable of overthrowing capitalism and laying the foundations for a new state. Now, comrades, when I started this lead off, you know, I half wished I would have, you know, 2 or 3 hours, but that was always a forlorn hope. And clearly I've had to miss out or just sketch over very briefly some very important events, but I hope I've given more of a theoretical underpinning to how we see the Cuban Revolution itself, because for us it's not about chronologies, it's not about what happened, so we read history in terms of the role of Che or the role of Fidel. It's about what were the social forces involved, what is the conscious weight of the working class then, but also what is the conscious weight of the working class now. And for Marxists, we study history in order to learn to apply it for tomorrow's struggles, and that's what we'll be going on to do this afternoon. So I'll leave it there and hope that, you know, comrades will come in with questions and also elaborate on some of the points I've only been able to touch on very briefly. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Robin.